Well, good morning. This morning, our lecture is about the foundations of Rome, the beginnings of a remarkable story that would eventually produce the world's largest empire, its longest enduring impact, an impact that we feel right up to the present day. But its earliest beginnings are shrouded in mystery, partly because written history about that period comes from hundreds of years later, written by people on the cusp of empire looking back at ways to justify the way that Rome had evolved. In Mary Beard's wonderful book entitled SPQR, she writes, Rome still helps to define the way we understand our world and think about ourselves. From high theory to low comedy, after 2,000 years, it continues to underpin Western culture and politics. She goes on and she says, the reasons why we can tell this story in such detail are very simple. The Romans themselves wrote a great deal about it. And a lot of what they wrote has survived. Modern historians often lament how little we can know about some aspects of the ancient world. But when it comes to Rome, there is a plethora of original surviving sources. But they're not always terribly reliable. Remember, history is not necessarily what happened, but what we remember that happened, or what we say we remember that happened. As she'll later say, there is often a fuzzy boundary between myth and history. And as we shall see, Rome is one of those cultures where that boundary is particularly blurred. So this morning, let's take a look at those early, albeit fuzzy, images of Rome's great beginning. It's the beginning of a truly great, great story. Today, we will explore the beginnings of Rome, the foundations of an empire that would reshape the world, the greatest empire of antiquity. According to John Buchan, Rome's republic, which preceded the empire, of course, endured half a millennium, only to become an empire which endured twice that length of time. It's a remarkable legacy, and it's a legacy that most historians assume provide the foundations for Western civilization. There's a fabulous new book. In fact, I picked it up while the seniors and Ms. Mahand and Mr. Shearer and I were in London. It's entitled Dominion. It's written by Tom Holland, who is a classical scholar and a professor in the UK. He lectures on Rome and Persian power in the ancient Near East, the emergence of Islam. But in his most recent book, Dominion, he takes a very different tack, one that most historians steer clear of, as he says. In the opening pages, he writes, although as a boy I was taken every Sunday to church, I solemnly said my prayers at night. I found myself at an early age experiencing what might be called an almost Victorian crisis of faith. He describes a scene from his childhood in Sunday school where this doubt emerged over a picture of the Garden of Eden with dinosaurs in it. He says, a faint shadow of doubt had been brought to darken my confidence in the truth of what I was being taught about the Christian faith. With time, it darkened further still. Now, my obsession with dinosaurs, glamorous, ferocious, extinct, evolved seamlessly into an obsession with ancient empires, When I read the Bible, the focus of my fascination was less with the children of Israel or Jesus and his disciples than their adversaries, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Romans. In a similar manner, although I vaguely continued to believe in God, I found him infinitely less charismatic than all the gods of the Greeks, Apollo, Athena, Dionysius. I liked the way that they did not lay down laws or condemn other deities as demons. I liked their rock star glamour. As a result, by the time I came to read Edward Gibbon and his great history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, I was more than ready to accept his interpretation of the triumph of Christianity, that it had ushered in an age of superstition and credulity. My childhood instinct to see the biblical God as the po-faced enemy of liberty and fun was rationalized, and I bemoaned the defeat of paganism. All the crusaders and inquisitors and black-hatted Puritans all just reinforced that contempt for Christianity. Color and excitement had been drained from the world by the Christian faith. Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean, wrote the Victorian poet Algernon Swinburne, echoing the apocryphal lament of Julian the Apostate, the last pagan emperor of Rome. The world has grown gray from thy breath. Holland says, instinctively, I agreed. But then he goes on and he says this, yet over the course of the past 2 decades, my perspective has changed. When I came to write my first works of history, I chose as my themes the 2 periods that had always most stirred and moved me as a child: the Persian invasions of Greece and the last decades of the Roman Republic. The years that I spent writing these twin studies of the classical world, living intimately in the company of Leonidas and of Julius Caesar, of the hoplites who had died at Thermopylae and the legionnaires who had crossed the Rubicon, only confirmed me in my fascination for Sparta and Rome, even when subjected to the minutest historical inquiry, retained their glamour as apex predators. They continued to stalk my imaginations as they had always done, like a great white shark, like a tiger, like Tyrannosaurus Rex. Yet, giant carnivores, however wondrous, are by their nature terrifying, Holland writes. The more years I spent immersed in the study of classical antiquity, so the more alien I increasingly found it. The values of Leonidas, whose people had practiced a peculiarly murderous form of eugenics and trained their young to kill uppity lowers by night, were nothing that I recognized as my own, nor those of Caesar, who reportedly killed more than 1 million Gauls and enslaved 1 million more. It was not just the extremes of callousness that unsettled me, but the complete lack of any sense that the poor or the weak might have the slightest intrinsic value. Why did I find this disturbing? Well, it was because, he writes, in my morals and ethics, I was not a Spartan or a Roman at all. That my belief in God had faded over the course of my teenage years did not mean that I had ceased to have Christian ethics. For a millennium and more, the civilization into which I had been born was Christendom. Assumptions that I had grown up with about how society should properly be organized and what principles we should uphold. They were not bred of classical antiquity. still less of human nature, but very distinctively of that civilization's Christian past. So profound has been the impact of Christianity on the development of the Western civilization that it has come to be hidden from view. It is the incomplete revolutions which are remembered. The fate of those which triumph is to be taken for granted. I wanted to read that extended passage to you at the beginning of this lecture simply because we bring to the study of Rome so many assumptions about its ubiquity, about the way that it frames our present world. In Mary Beard's SPQR, History of Ancient Rome, she writes that it's remarkable that all of the civilizations that followed after Rome modeled themselves on Rome. Governments built buildings that were in the style of Rome. Just go to Washington, D.C., for instance. But is that illusion or fact? Tom Holland argues that it's much more illusion than we think. That's what we'll explore as we begin this study of the Roman Republic. Before we take a look at that, though, I want to remind you that even though we're in this extraordinary period of lockdown and social distancing and quarantine, we're still doing our 40-hour capstone project. Most of you have gotten your approval already in writing from me by email. It's important that the concept that you use is developed from your antiquity coursework, pursuing a particular interest or passion or sense of calling or avocation. So what that means is that you've got to be able to tie your project into the study of antiquity. And it's not as simple as, well, they used weapons in the ancient world and I decided to make a weapon. It's not exactly like anything that you used in the ancient world, but here you go. Instead, you need to be able to do research to demonstrate the historicity and accuracy of your undertaking. Your grade will be based on craftsmanship and presentation. Craftsmanship is simply excellence, authenticity, and its relation to your calling. And the presentation, of course, depends upon both rhetorical and artistic vision executed well. You'll need to log your 40 hours on a timesheet signed by your parents, and we're still making this assignment due Tuesday, May the 5th. It may very well be, if we're still in lockdown, that we'll have to do our presentations through something like a Zoom meeting or through YouTube presentations, but we're going to finish this school year one way or another. Today is March the 31st. Now, I realize you're probably listening to this and viewing this lecture sometime in April, but as I record this, it is March the 31st. And it was on this day in 1596 that French philosopher René Descartes was born in La Haye near Tours in France. Known as the father of modern philosophy, he based his theory of knowledge by locating the point of certainty in the awareness of self as conveyed in the maxim cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Also on this day, in 1630, John Donne, the English metaphysical poet and dean of St. Paul's, died in London. He had written that any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sinned to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. He's best known for his spiritual and romantic poetry. His work is striking for its use of vivid imagery. Also known for vivid imagery, in 1855, English writer Charlotte Bronte, author of Jane Eyre, died in Haworth in Yorkshire. And in 1925, an act of Congress authorized sculptor Gutzon Borgium to carve the likeness of Presidents Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt on the granite face of Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills of South Dakota. It was an idea that he had conceived by reading a history of the Roman Republic. In ancient Rome, the creation of great monuments to the heroes of the nation were commonplace. And he wanted to create something that was even more monumental than anything that ancient Rome had ever produced. The story of ancient Rome and its monuments were rooted in myth. And as I mentioned in the introduction to this lecture, it's really difficult in ancient Rome to untangle myth and history. They are so woven together that even Rome's best historians, Suetonius and Livy, for instance, regularly rely upon myth for the structure of their stories. For instance, Livy points to the foundations of the city of Rome in the story of Romulus and Remus. He says that the city was founded on April the 21st, 753 BC, on the 7 hills that lined the Tiber River just inland from the sea. The story of Romulus and Remus is a sordid one. It seems that they were the grandchildren of King Numitor of Alba Longa. His brother overthrew him, and when it was discovered that he had grandchildren, the usurper decided to kill the children. They were cast into the Tiber River. But according to the mythic story, they were rescued and suckled by a she-wolf, grew up eventually to be taken in by a shepherd and his wife. They became leaders of men, largely brigands and vagabonds and exiles, and put together a plan to capture territory, which they did along the Tiber River among the 7 hills, and there they established a city. It was eventually named for Romulus and not Remus because, as the myth, the story goes, Romulus and Remus came to an argument. Some versions say it was an argument about who should rule the city. Some versions say that it was because of an offense that Remus made to Romulus's attempt to build a wall. And some say that it was simply a matter of a kind of sibling rivalry between the two boys, and the end result was that Romulus killed Remus and took leadership of the little settlement of his own. But because the city was settled largely by these vagabonds, brigands, and exiles, it was a town without women. It was all men. So Romulus contrived of this trick. He would invite the local leaders of the Sabines to come and enjoy the festivities of a grand celebration in the newly founded city of Rome. While they were there, he would give a signal that the men would be scattered and the women would be captured, and they would be brought into their homes, and they would take those women as their wives. The rape of the Sabines and the murder of Remus were thus the dubious beginnings of the city of Rome. But there was another mythic story. It's sort of the tail end of the story of the Trojan War. Like the story of Odysseus, there was a prince of the city of Troy who happened to be able to escape. His name was Aeneas, and after travels and adventures, very much like Ulysses, he arrived at the mouth of the river Tiber, made his way up, discovered the 7 hills, and there decided to settle. But he was quickly overruled by his men. They became restless, looking for grander adventure, and they determined that they would set out. But their womenfolk liked the place of the 7 hills. They'd grown weary of travel, and they refused to go. When the men decided that they would force them, the women set their ships on fire, and the men decided that they would settle in Rome after all. The leader of the women and their plot was named Roma, and the city was named for her. But there was a third mythic story, the story about 7 kings, one for each of the 7 hills, and of their grand alliance that eventually led to the foundations of the city and the establishing of a forum set between the 7 hills. Livy attempted to reconcile all 3 of the stories, now arguing that Romulus and Remus were actually great-great-grandchildren of Aeneas, and that the 7 kings were the kings who in succession after Romulus ruled the city. Whatever the case may be, one of the things that emerges from these mythic tales is that the Romans always saw themselves as an accumulation of vagabonds, exiles, and brigands. It became a part of their national story and a part of their character. Now, ethnologists and anthropologists say that rather than the myth shaping the people, it was the culture, the people, that shaped the myths. In other words, sometime in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC and AD, writers looked at Rome, constructed mythic stories from the past to justify why Rome was the way that it was, and then told the stories that way. Whatever the case may be, that Rome began to model itself on these mythic stories, and both the concept of civil war and of conquest and of taking what is not theirs, that became a part of the story of the city of Rome. The settlement of Rome itself had several threads of ethnicity, just like it had several threads of myth. In the far south of Rome, in the Italian peninsula, there was the Mediterranean culture of the Verdunes. The Verdunic culture was shaped largely by its trade with the Phoenicians and the Greeks, and it was very, very distinctively Mediterranean. In the north, there were the Celts and the Tuscans. They had an alpine culture. Whereas the Verduns were settled and tended to be traders, the Celts and the Tuscans tended to be warriors and migratory and focused on conquest rather than on trade. And then in the center of the Italian peninsula, looking east and west rather than north and south, were the Etruscans and the Latins, from which the Romans took their language. These ethnic threads were woven together eventually to make up the Roman culture and help to shape the kind of institutions and values that would mark Rome from its beginning all the way through to its ending. From about 750 BC to 509 or 510 BC, the city was ruled by a series of kings. Mythically, it was said that they were the seven kings ruling on the seven hills. The timeline probably precludes that from being a historic reality. But the point is that Rome was like very much all of the other tribal peoples of antiquity. They had their namlugals, their dictatorial, authoritarian leaders who led them and who had absolute control over the people in a stratified tribal kind of structure. By 387, the city-state had morphed into a kind of elective republic. The transition from 509 to about 387 was slow, and yet by the time we get to 387 and the beginning of wars of conquest against the Celts in the north and the Etruscans to the east and west, we start to see a pattern of republican government, of checks and balances, of separation of powers, and of stratified society. By the time we get to the end of the Celtic and Etruscan wars, between 282 and 287, we start to see the emergence of two classes of people that dominate the culture from this point on: the patricians and the equestrians. In a moment, we'll take a look at what that actually means, but they're just classes of society growing out of the old Verdunic, Celtic, Tuscan, Etruscan, and Latin tribal structures. And then by the time we get to 133, we start to see the disintegration of the institutions of the Republic. And from the two brothers, the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, all the way to the time of Julius Caesar, the Republic functions essentially in name only, no longer in fact. And we start to see the emergence, bit by bit, of hegemony from the upper and the lower seas, as they were called, Mare Tyrrhenium and Mare Adriaticum, literally thinking of their world in east and west terms. Remember, they don't have maps, so they don't even know that they're on a peninsula. And their conquests tend to be relational rather than geographical and territorial. In other words, they spread their sphere of influence based on trade and marriage and relationship and locality, rather than any particular ambition to create an empire. The idea of empire was still a long, long way off. Nevertheless, the little town of Rome began to have greater and greater influence over time. We see here the transition. The first map shows, between the 6th and the 4th centuries. The second map shows the 3rd to the 2nd century BC and the vast spread of the influence of the Roman civilization. But we have to remember at this point, it's still pretty much a thalassocracy. A thalassocracy is essentially a trade influence rather than actual governance. These territories were not necessarily centralized under the authority of the Roman Republic. Instead, influential generals would go out, conquer territory, maintain control over it militarily, oftentimes with private armies, and then use their relationships back in Rome, tying it all together to create a kind of corporate structure rather than a governmental structure. It's important for us to see that this fit into that tribal structure, which eventually becomes the Republican classes. So at the top of the tribal structure were the patricians. These were the patriarchal and oligarchic upper class members, the nobles, the royals, if you will. Beneath them were the equestrians. These are the aristocratic upper class. These are moneyed peoples. They may not have long and ancient histories, but they've got wealth and land and power. Then there were the plebes, or the plebeians. This was the working middle class, as well as all of the conquered Latins and Etruscans who were granted Roman citizenship. And this is one of the unique features of the Republican idea that developed among the Romans. This is something that never existed in ancient Greece. Even at the height of Athens' golden age of democracy. What the Romans did was they granted to their conquered neighboring territories Roman citizenship. And this was to extend to them all of the legal rights of Roman citizenry. But what it also did was it brought them in rather than simply brought them under the authority of Rome. The fourth class was what was called the liberti, the lower class members who were freedmen. These weren't slaves, they weren't serfs. Instead, they were people who had no wealth, no power, no money, but nevertheless, they had their freedom. And they had the ability to move up into the plebeian class by hard work, by luck, or by good fortune. Then there were the menemesio. The menemesio were the enslaved craftsmen and tradesmen. These are slaves, but they're slaves who have particular gifts, skills. These are doctors and barbers. It is very likely, for instance, that the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, Luke the physician, was at one time a menemesio. The menemesio were able at various times to gain their liberty, moving into the plebeian class because of their skills. They sometimes could even buy their way out of slavery. Or if their slavery was a term, they could serve their term and then move into freedom. On the other hand, the servi were chattel slaves. These were people who could never gain their freedom. They were literally treated as cattle. They were property. And with this sort of tribal structure, we begin to see the emergence of a unique Roman civilization. At first, the city of Rome and its conquered territories or its annexed territories, sometimes territories joined simply for the privilege of having Roman citizenship or because of the possibility of economic prosperity. But the structure of the government at first was based upon those old tribal traditions that went all the way back to the Verdunic, Celtic, Tuscan, Etruscan, and Latin cultures. But they were also tied together by a distinctive vision of Roman virtue and honor. The principles of Roman virtue became the foundations of the whole civilization and provided a means by which later things like the checks and balances, the 12 tables of the law, and even the principles for mercantilism and traditionalism could be passed on and enforced. The virtues were divided into two different parts. This is what is called Roman osoites, the idea of piety or ethics. The cardinal virtues were mirrored on the cardinal virtues that both Plato and Aristotle identified: temperance, prudence, courage, and justice, the four cardinal virtues. Of course, for the Greeks, prudence was replaced with wisdom. But the Romans gave a particular twist to the idea of virtue and piety. The word virtue actually comes from the word for man, vir, and it simply means what is natural to a man. So what the Romans were attempting to do is create a humanistic piety, a humanistic system of ethics that mirrored what they saw in natural man, at his best, but natural man nevertheless. So sophrosine, the idea of temperance, was largely the notion of alertness, not moderation as we might think of it. Similarly, phronesis, or prudence, was not so much the idea of cautiousness, but rather the idea of cunning. Andrea, or courage, was really ferocity, not bravery. And dikaiosine was not so much the kind of justice that we think about, the practical doing of right. Instead, it was pragmatism. It was an unrelenting pragmatism, whatever works. Now, these four cardinal virtues were supplemented by 5 ordinal virtues: humor, mercy, discipline, thrift, and truthfulness. But again, these words don't necessarily mean what we might think they would mean. So comitas for the Romans literally meant clever, not necessarily joyous. Clemencia, the word for mercy, did not mean the kind of graceful mercy that we think of, but rather the willingness to negotiate with defeated foes. Dignitas, or discipline, meant skilled, not necessarily diligent. And frugalitas, or thrift, meant pragmatic, not necessarily an exercise of stewardship. Veritas, or truthfulness, meant more transparency than it did honesty. Nevertheless, the Romans looked upon this standard of virtue, cardinal virtues and ordinal virtues, this great vision of piety or ethics, as the foundation upon which the entire society was built. And virtually everything that they did drew from these cardinal and ordinal virtues. So when they tried to envision any area of their worldview, they returned again and again to these virtues. They talked about government, or religion, or commerce, or art, or music, or literature, or science, or architecture. Always the distinctives of their worldview were rooted in the foundations of the worldview. Now, we'll come back and we'll see how this works at a later time, but it's important for us to realize that as the Romans began to reform and structure their republic, creating checks and balances, writing 12 tables of the law, developing their system of trade and mercantilism and conquest, balancing that with all of their tribal traditions, that what they were attempting to do was live out this standard of piety. The structure of government that they developed was quite remarkable. The Roman Republic was divided into two large pieces. There was the populace and there was the imperium. Governing the populace and the imperium were the comitia, the representative assembly, and the exercitus urbanus, the town militias. The comitia, the representative assembly, would choose consuls, praetors, and equestrians to serve in the administration of the city, its various oversee its laws, as well as its commercial enterprises, and they were, in a sense, checked and balanced by the Senate, the Treasury, and the proconsuls chosen by the town militias. And between them, they would then exercise authority over the provinces through local administrations. The Romans were largely created in terms of their expanse of territory and their influence in trade and commerce by military conquest. And so several of these offices, the proconsuls, the consuls, the praetors, the equestrians, and the imperium, were all, in a sense, military offices, which has led some to argue that Rome never really was a republic. It was more of a military structure with various committees. Regardless of whether or not that is the case, what we do see is the beginning of checks and balances. For instance, every year a new set of consuls was elected out of the Senate by the comitia. The comitia would choose two men, and the men would alternate as the imperium over the administration of the city. So each man would take a month and administrate all of the laws, all of the trade, all of the foreign affairs through the authority of the Senate and the Treasury, utilizing proconsuls as diplomats overseas, or perhaps generals in the battlefield. And so every month you would have a switch. So in January it would be one consul, Then the second consul would come in February, and then in March, the first consul would resume his duties, and in April, the second consul would resume his duties. The idea was checks and balances, separation of powers. The treasury was still controlled by the Senate. The field command was still controlled by the proconsuls, and provinces were under local administrations, but the consuls had to manage the whole thing with the help of the praetors and the equestrians. It's the beginning of separation of powers. It's the beginning of the idea of real administrative federal government. Now, this system was constantly in need of reform, especially as the wealth of the city of Rome increased beyond anything that any of them could have ever imagined, and as their armies continued to have great success in bringing neighboring territories into the Republic. In 133 BC, a reformer by the name of Tiberius Gracchi, who was actually the tribune for the plebeians, he was a representative for the lower classes, began to agitate for radical reforms that would bring greater prosperity to the middle class and to the lower classes. He was obviously a threat to the elite, the aristocrats, and all of those equestrians and the great and powerful men of the patrician class. And the result was that he was overthrown and he was murdered. It was the first time that outright violence had marked the Republic since the time of Romulus and Remus. Nevertheless, 10 years later, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchi, came to power and attempted to bring about some of those same reforms. The forces arrayed themselves in such a way that, in the end, the reality of the Republic, the separation of powers, began to disintegrate as Rome tilted toward one dictatorial power over another. So that by 88 BC, one of the greatest of all of the generals of the day, a man by the name of Sulla, came to power and assumed dictatorial powers. In one sense, he brought stability to the whole of the experiment, but in another sense, he brought about the destruction of all that was dreamed of with the separation of powers, and the result was that the Roman Republic never recovered. Lucius, Sulla, Felix was consul twice and was made dictator for a time. He eventually retired to his farm and died shortly thereafter, but the Republic was never the same. By the time we get to the year 66, the old Republic is just limping along. There's tremendous wealth and tremendous power. There are great armies that are quelling rebellions all along the frontier, but the structures of power were no longer functioning well. As a result, there was the rise of another great general. His name was Lucius Sergius Catiline, and he attempted to bring about radical reforms. He was defeated 3 times as a consul, And so he decided to take power in his own hands. But the plot, the conspiracy, was exposed by Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero gave a famous speech in the Temple of Jupiter, and the conspiracy was exposed, and Catiline was sent into exile. But now it was evident to all that the structure of the Republic was no longer sustainable. It was about this time that three powerful generals, Julius Caesar, Gaius Pompey, and Gaius Gracchus, decided to ally themselves together to bring some sort of stability and sensibility to the old republic. Their alliance came to be known as the First Triumvirate. But Gracchus, who was jealous of Caesar and Pompey's great victories in battle, went off to the east and was defeated in a terrible rout against the Parthians and was himself killed. That meant that there was just Caesar and Pompey, two men of soaring ambitions, and the empire was simply a foregone conclusion at that point. The Republic still existed technically, but by the end of a brief civil war between Caesar and Pompey, Caesar ascended to the authority that Sulla once had as a dictator and transformed the Republic into an empire. Now, he refused to crown himself, and of course, he very famously, on the Ides of March in 44 BC, was killed by his friends in the Senate. Nevertheless, he changed the structure of the old republic and turned it into an empire, a military dictatorship, and it would remain a military dictatorship from that day forward. Eventually, that military dictatorship began to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. And by the time that Julius Caesar's chosen successor, his nephew and adopted son, Augustus Caesar, came to govern, the world was now a Roman world. As Senator Padme Amidala from Star Wars 3 says, "So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause." The lessons from the Romans' descent into authoritarianism are not lost on us today. When a time of crisis comes, do we cede our liberty for the sake of security? Are we willing to suspend our constitutional rights and the rule of law for the sake of security given to us, stability given to us by a centralized governmental authority? The coronavirus has given us an opportunity to see what it is that we're made of and how this current test turns out will say much about the enduring value of the American experiment in liberty. This is why it is so very, very important for those of us who think and see and understand to be strong and courageous, to do the work that the Lord has entrusted to us, not being afraid, not being discouraged, and knowing that the Lord our God is seated upon the throne. He rules and reigns, and his purposes shall be done. He is with us. Thanks be to God. Let me pray. Father, as we look at our own day, through the lens of the day of the Romans and the disintegration of their republic, we're reminded that even the strongest, wealthiest, even the best intended, even the civilizations rooted in a supposed virtue can eventually collapse and fall into the grips of authoritarian rule. We pray that you would make us wise to preserve the extraordinary freedoms that we have, to work hard, to do that under your authority, acknowledging your ways at all times. I pray for these students. I pray particularly for our seniors who have had an extraordinary end of their year. I pray that you would make them wise in all of these things and that you would grow us up in grace. For I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen and amen.